Welcome once again to one of our lessons in the 5th grade class. If you notice, my voice is sounding much different this morning. I came down with a cold, and I didn't want to hand off any of those germs to anybody else. So I wanted to make sure that you got a lesson that was in line with what we've been working on, but I didn't want to expose you to anything bad. So I'm sitting here with my cough drops and my Kleenexes and my little cup of cranberry juice to try and help get through this. And I guess by the time I edit out all the sniffles, nose wiping, coughs, and sneezes, whatever else might come along, this could be a short video without much left of value. But I wanted you to at least know that I was working with you and helping to try and keep this program moving. If you remember, the last couple of lessons have involved this great big heavy barn rope. And it symbolized, or it was the tangible way of saying God's love is like a giant cord or hawser, which is a giant rope that holds ships to the pier. This is a very old, very well used barn rope that has seen better days, but it's still so strong you can't break it. So that is our definition of God's big, strong, heavy cords of love that keep us together. And so we're working on the same series. We have the same verse. The March memory verse is this one: put up with one another. Now, while I won't argue with the scripture, I like the phrase bear with one another. Bear with one another. That has a different picture to me. Years ago, there was a stamp that the post office put out, and it had the older brother carrying his much younger brother on his back, and the phrase across the bottom is, "He's not heavy, he's my brother," which means I can bear with my brother. So that, with that idea in mind, put up with one another, bear with one another, forgive one another. If you're holding something against someone, forgive just as the Lord forgave you. And that comes from Colossians 3:13. Put up with one another, or bear with one another. Forgive one another. If you're holding something against someone, forgive just as the Lord forgave you. Colossians 3:13. And then at the bottom, in the middle, you can see I highlighted some things. And I'm using the same one from last week. Freely you have received forgiveness. Freely. Jesus Christ does not expect us to pay a toll. He does not expect us to try and repay. Remember last week we talked about the man who had owed the king 10,000 bags of gold. 10,000 bags of gold. And when he asked the king to forgive the debt, the king did. Okay. Now, I'm working on this because in 2020, we don't really understand what a bag of gold means, let alone 100 bags of gold, let alone 1,000 bags of gold. Not only that, but it's completely beyond our understanding to think about 10,000 bags of gold and how much that servant was in debt to. his king. You see, we really don't understand money. One of the boys asked me last week, he said, how did he get in so much debt? What did he do to get that much debt? Well, when you're talking about money, you can try and say, okay, well, the economy had a turn down, or he lost it on the stock market or something. But when you're talking about forgiveness, we do lots of things to hurt each other, to disappoint each other, to let each other down. If you remember, last week, and we will continue to talk about it this week, we said God always has two sides of his love. The unconditional side, which is the always, I don't care what, I'm going to love you kind of unconditional love. And then he has the if kind of love, which means if you want to be my disciple, if you want to be my friend, here's what you will do. You'll obey my commandments. And they're overlapping, and they're actually, like superimposed on each other, so that God's always 100% unconditional, absolutely no conditions on it, and 100% conditional. Now, we can't understand that in our life because we tend to think of them as kind of like this. They're overlap. Maybe some people are more this way, but they overlap. And here's the thing. I've done counseling for hundreds and hundreds of couples, and they come into my office and we talk about premarital counseling, and we talk about what it's going to be like when they're married, and it's exciting, it's fun, it's very informational, very positive. We just laugh and have a wonderful time. But I sometimes start by asking the question, just how far will you go? You say you love this person, this woman, or you love this man. How far are you willing to go? Well, they had never thought about that. That's not an issue that you think about when you're trying to get married, because everybody's being really nice to each other, and everybody's very happy, everybody's very pleasant, very hopeful. We've got all these dreams, these aspirations, these wonderful... Thinking about that bad stuff? So I just start making some suggestions. Let's just say the husband here ends up with a gambling problem. How long are you willing to put up with that? Let's say she gets sick, and the doctors say that she'll never be able to get out of the bed again. Never be a full functioning, normal, everyday, up and around type person. What happens? What are you going to do? What's the situation going to be if you find out that one or the other has been lying to the other, covering up, doing things that are sneaky, behind scenes, not being honest? See, not a lot of people think about what it's going to be like once they get married and real life begins to settle in on them. Let me explain by using the Bible story for this week. We've had our memory verse, we've had our introduction, we've seen this chords of love. Luke 19, the 19th chapter of Luke, has a very interesting story. And I would say most people, I'll even go so far as most pastors, don't read this story with enough inflection as to what it means. You see, we got to be careful here when we're talking about this, because all of the stories of Jesus, when he's teaching on the mountainside, when he's feeding the 5,000, when he's healing people of leprosy, those are things out there in the big, whole, big, wide earth that he was taking care of. Up in Judea, up in the north, in Galilee, in Capernaum, he went over to the Decapolis and healed a couple of people that were possessed by demons. He came back, he raised people from the dead. He did different things, different places, but suddenly our Gospels zone in, almost like taking the wide lens and going down to this microscopic lens, because we are now walking the last few miles of Jesus' earthly life. We haven't quite gotten to getting to the top of the Mount of Olives and beginning the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, which is just about a week before he is put on trial. We haven't gotten to the top of the mountain, climbing up the hill up to Bethany, to where Jesus is going to raise Lazarus. We're still down here in the bottom, close to the Jordan River. It's a big, steep, long walk up the mountainside from Jericho and the Jordanian plain, the river of Jordan plain, straight up the mountain to Bethany. It's a long walk, but it's the way you get from the main highway, you might say, up to where the temple is in Jerusalem. So we're in the last dozen days, 10 days maybe, of Jesus' life, and he is making his final approach into Jerusalem. From this moment forward, everything Jesus says and does has this extra intensity. Everything he's doing is not just happen to run into somebody along the path and she touches the hem of his garment and she's healed, and and I give you the healing, I set you free. Not just random experiences. These are on purpose things. These are intentional things because they have some important dynamic meaning to Jesus. He's in Jericho. Let's start reading Luke 19. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector. I mean, he was a big wheel. He had many tax collectors underneath him. He was the supervisor and he was the boss of the entire tax collecting team in that area. Jericho was a shipping center. It was like the Amazon hub. Everybody coming and going north to south, east to west had to go through Jericho, and Zacchaeus touched them all with his own little extra tax as they went through Jericho. He was the chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today." So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. And all the people saw this and began to mutter, "Jesus has gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, that's Jesus, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anyone out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Okay, Zacchaeus, wee little man was he, up in Sycamore Tree. Let's just pretend for a second, okay? We're going to do a little bit like what we did with the couples earlier. These are not stories in the Bible, so this is all just pretend. And I want you to get your thumbs ready. I want you to either say yes or no. No. Yes or no. And the question is, how far are you going to go? How far are you going to go? Okay. Let's pretend that forgiveness that came to Zacchaeus, the salvation that came to Zacchaeus, was personal. Let's say, just for instance, that Zacchaeus had done something to harm Jesus somewhere back in his life. Do you understand? We're making this up. It's pretend. But if someone hasn't hurt you, how hard is it to forgive? If it didn't cost me anything, it's not hard to forgive. Jesus went to this man's house in a shocking way. It was a shocking turn of events. It was a intentional, purpose-driven, intentional learning time. It wasn't just, oh, here's a nice man who needs to come back into the house of Israel. He turned his back on his people. He had become a traitor. He'd gone to work for the Romans. He was one of the most despised people in the entire world. The Romans were the enemy, and the Romans made life hard on the Israelite people. The Romans were merciless. But the only ones who were less merciful, more harsh, were Israelite people who had turned on their own people and started working with the Romans. So let's just pretend. Let's pretend that Zacchaeus had done something to harm Jesus. Do you think Jesus would be willing to forgive? Stick your thumbs up. Do you think Jesus would be willing to forgive? It was pretty bad. I'm making up a story. Let's pretend that the two boys grew up together in Nazareth. Best friends. Very best friends. Let's just pretend. I can make it up. Let's pretend that the two of them were like inseparable until one day one of the friends decided he was going to be so angry at the way he'd been treated for being shorter than the rest of the people, smaller than the rest of his friends and buddies. And he turned into an angry, mean, nasty person. And he started exacting revenge on all the people that he had grown up with. Okay, can Jesus still forgive? Let's pretend that Zacchaeus went over to start working with the Romans just so that he could get other people that had always looked down on him, despised him, hated him, and he could sit there and go, yeah, now I'm the one that's the boss of you. You have to give me what I tell you is your tax burden. So the Romans didn't care how much he charged. As long as they got their cut, he could charge anything he wanted to. So let's say he started going around all of his friends and neighbors, former friends, former neighbors there in Nazareth, and taking more than he was due. Could Jesus forgive that? What do you think? Let's take the story a bit farther. Let's say that the Romans saw what he was doing, saw the money he was bringing in, wanted to encourage him to do even better, and said, now you have to go after even the people, not just the ones who had been mean to you, but you have to go after your own friends. Let's say you went after Jesus and Jesus' family. Let's say he put a terrible burden on them. Let's say he took everything that they owned because he had the power to put them in jail. Let's say he charged them so much that Joseph, the carpenter, no longer had any tools. His house and his shop were confiscated. Let's say that he was put into prison as a debtor, income tax evasion of Jesus' time. Could Jesus forgive putting his dad in prison unfairly, against the law, against the rules? Let's say that his dad, imprisoned as he was, got sick in prison and died. Did that happen in Scripture? No. No. But do you think that Jesus could look up in that sycamore tree and see the man who punished his family, who did unspeakable things to their family and their future and all the things that it meant that they were, and maybe even caused the early death of his father? Do you think that's something Jesus could forgive? What do you think? How far will you go? Here's the question. Jesus was making a point. He wasn't talking about 10,000 bags of gold, as in last week's story. He was talking about massive amounts of hate, massive amounts of greed, massive amounts of sorrow that had been caused. Maybe not to his family, maybe not to his own friends, but Zacchaeus had that in his background. He had done that. He had robbed, he had cheated, he had lied, he had covered up. He had been a very nasty, greedy, angry man. Now do you see why everybody kind of went, oh, Jesus is going home with a really bad dude. What in the world do you want to hang out with him for? There are so many nice people in town. Why wouldn't he want to stay with Mary and Martha and Lazarus, all these good people? He's going to the house of a crook, a bum, a traitor. He owes thousands of bags of gold to the people that he's robbed and hurt. You see, It isn't about the money. It's about the heart. Not about how much you can put in your bag. It's what's in your heart. Zacchaeus, in one afternoon, accepted forgiveness, salvation, and grace, turned from the life that he had been living and completely flipped it on its head. A complete turnaround, we call that conversion. When you actually take one idea of what's driving your life and you turn it around the other way. I will give away half of my possessions to the poor, it says. Wait a minute. Half of my possessions to the poor. Half. That's a big percentage. Half to people he hadn't cheated. Half of his wealth to people who didn't really deserve it. And then, if I've cheated anybody, there was a bunch of them going to come collect. I'll pay back 4 times. Do you know what that means in 2002 talk? Zacchaeus declared bankruptcy in one afternoon. All of his possessions, all of his wealth, all of his houses, everything was going to go away. And what did he get in return? He got to feel connected to his Father in heaven again. He got to feel that he was a part of the kingdom, the promised people. He got to be included in the people of the promise. You can't put a number on that. You can't put a value on that because it's too precious. Look, we told a story last week about one of the prophets of the Old Testament. And Hosea, we said, had 3 children that he gave very cruel sounding names because his wife had broken her marriage promises to him, and she'd gotten herself into all kinds of problems. I didn't really finish the story last week because this is the week you were going to ask yourself, how far will you go? How far? How far is that loving commitment to forgive going to carry you? Well, Hosea found out that his wife had gotten herself into so much trouble, and she had created so much sorrow, not only to himself and to his family, his 3 kids, but she had run up such a debt that the people who she owed put her in slavery. And this isn't in prison. And this is not a person going to prison. This is a person who is being put in slavery. So, in that time, in that period, when you owed more than what you could ever pay, more than what anybody could ever expect. They took away everything about your life. They stripped you down to nothing. They put you on the block and said, who wants to take what's left of this person? Who wants to purchase what's left that this person might still be able to contribute, can do for you? House cleaning, cleaning the stables, working in the garden, working in the farm. Whatever they were told to do, they had to do. They were slaves. They were imprisoned in human bondage. Hosea went down to the slave market. God told him to wait there until his wife came up on the platform where she was going to be sold. It was painful. This was his wife. And when she came up on the platform, and all the people around looking at her, Hosea looked at her and saw his wife. So when the bidding started, he bought his own wife from the slave market. It cost him. You can read in the book of Hosea how much he paid. It's a nice little sum. I can't figure it out. Bags of wheat and, produce of different kinds. I mean, I don't have a value that I can put on that, but he paid a price. And he took his wife home to be a slave? No, to be his wife again. How far will you go? Will you go down to the slave market? And buy your own wife no matter what it cost you? You see, God says, my love will go to the absolute limit. You can't even measure how far I'll go. 10,000 bags of gold doesn't touch it. I love you. And there's nothing I won't forgive if you want to be a part of my family again. Now the story of Hosea is that she did come back. She did come and realize how much he had given her and how much he had gone to the limits to make sure that she was taken care of. He saved her life more than once. And she realized what she had been given. Zacchaeus, for his part, realized how much he had been given. And he never hesitated and said, I'd like to hold back part of my wealth to myself. I don't want to give it all away. I'll give half away to the poor. I'll give 4 times away. No, he let it all pour out. He just let it all pour out. I am so thankful to have God's forgiveness, His grace, His reconciliation. I'll pour it all out. He emptied his pockets. He emptied his bank accounts. He emptied the treasure house. He emptied his home. He emptied everything and poured it all out because he realized how precious it was that he had been forgiven. When our Bible verse says, put up with one another. Put up? Bear with one another. Carry one another. That's what God was trying to tell us. That's what God was doing to show us. And to be honest, whatever that made-up story that I told, no matter how that crazy story might have sounded, that was nothing to what Jesus endured on that Friday at his trial, during his disgrace, during his suffering, during his beating, during his crucifixion. That little story was just a plaything compared to what actually happened on that Black Friday. And what was his reaction? What did he do? He said, Father, forgive them. Father, forgive them. Just like he did for Zacchaeus. Just like Hosea did for his wife. God's love is incredible when it comes to the point of saying, this is how far I will go for you. Now, come back. I haven't finished my memory verse yet. Going back to my memory verse. Freely you have received his forgiveness. Freely now you must give forgiveness. There isn't any limit. There isn't any limit. Something to think about. Something to pray about. Thank you for listening.